Peppa woke up in complete darkness. No sound, no glimmer of light, as if the world had vanished. She looked around, but George wasn't there. The house was silent, and even the walls felt unfamiliar. Peppa's hoof touched George's toy dinosaur on the floor, but George himself seemed to have dissolved into nothing. The window, which usually opened onto the garden and street, now showed only a black void, dense and bottomless. She carefully approached the door. The floorboards creaked too loudly, though she could usually walk without a sound. Her heart pounded, her breath grew unsteady. When she stepped into the hallway, it felt as if something in the dark was watching her. The walls seemed alive. Strange shadows rippled across their surface, shadows that shouldn't have been there. "George!" Peppa called, but the only reply was her own voice echoing back at her, as if the house had too many empty rooms. She took a few steps toward the stairs, and just then, the lamp above her flickered. Light flared, then instantly died. But in that moment, Peppa saw a figure standing at the bottom of the stairs. Tall, distorted, as though stretched out of the darkness. Its eyes glowed red, and from its mouth came a strange, low sound, an echoing, broken melody. "Tongue! Tongue! Saha!" the figure hissed. Peppa froze. Her legs felt rooted to the floor. Her heart stopped. Her mouth went dry. The creature lifted its hand and stepped forward. The floor groaned beneath it, but the footsteps sounded as if they came from several places at once. Peppa instinctively closed her eyes and pressed her ears with her hooves, but the melody only grew louder. She could hear it inside her head now, along with a whisper, "You're watching this, aren't you? Press the HYPE button below the video, or he'll come for you too." Peppa opened her eyes and screamed. The creature was closer now. Its movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Its face was too long, its mouth stretched too wide, and its eyes burned brighter and brighter red. She backed away, but the hallway grew longer. Each step didn't bring her closer to her room, but instead dragged her deeper into the house. Doors on either side opened on their own, and from each came the same whisper, "Tongue, tongue, Saha." Peppa ran to her parents' room and pushed the door open, desperate for safety. But the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, belongings carefully placed, as if her parents had never lived there. On the wall mirror, she saw not herself, but George. He stood motionless, his eyes hollow, his mouth moving, repeating the creature's words. Peppa stumbled back in horror. The mirror cracked, and George from the reflection stepped forward, trying to emerge. The girl screamed and bolted into the hall. Lights flickered everywhere, and each time they lit, the silhouette of Tung Tung Sahur appeared. Sometimes ahead of her, sometimes behind, sometimes right beside her. She burst into the living room. The television switched on by itself, showing only static, and from the speakers came the same melody. On the screen flashed her own face, twisted, foreign. Its lips moved, and it spoke. "You cannot escape." Peppa clamped her hooves over her ears, shut her eyes, pressed against the wall. But the sound only grew stronger. The air thickened around her, and every shadow in the room began to shift, stretching toward the center. The creature slowly emerged from the darkness. Its hands reached for Peppa, fingers too long, bent like hooks. It tilted its head, and its mouth split into a grin filled with alien, inhuman joy. "Tonight will not end," Tung Tung Sahur intoned. His voice echoed from the TV, from the mirror, from the shadows themselves. Peppa screamed, but her voice drowned in the roaring melody. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The world quaked around her, walls pulling apart and closing again, the ceiling rising higher, turning the house into an endless maze. The last thing she saw were the creature's burning red eyes. They loomed closer and closer until they filled her vision completely. And then came darkness, silence, and a whisper faint but clear. She's ours now. Early in the morning, Peppa Pig's family set out for a picnic in the enchanted forest. Daddy Pig carried a heavy basket of food, Mummy Pig held George by the hoof, and Peppa ran ahead, promising to find the most secret place. On a meadow by the stream, they spread a blanket and laid out the treats. George already reached for the cake, but Daddy gently reminded him, "Vegetables first, George." After lunch, Daddy suggested hide and seek. "I'll count to 100, you hide." Peppa and George darted behind an oak and held their breath. But when they peeked out, there was only silence. No steps, no voices, even the stream seemed hushed. The sun leaned toward the horizon, and the forest grew unfamiliar. They tried to find the meadow again, but every path led back. Every tree looked the same. Darkness fell quickly. In a rock, they found a low, damp cave and hid inside. It smelled of moss and moisture. George whimpered and Peppa whispered, "We're together. We'll manage." Then branches cracked outside, closer and closer. In the darkness, 2 red sparks flared. They did not blink. There were old tales of the deer monster. Its antlers parted branches. Its steps shifted paths. A growl burst from the dark, shaking the ground. Peppa grabbed George. "Run!" They bolted and saw a light ahead, an old hut among the thickets. They rushed inside and slammed the crooked door. The air was heavy, the walls rotten. In the corner lay a chest, a rusty shovel and axe. Outside, something circled the hut and pressed against the threshold. Then the walls shook, struck by huge antlers. "Make noise!" whispered Peppa, and they banged on the pot and the chest lid. A guttural roar answered, and the door cracked. Moonlight fell through a hole in the roof. The children pushed the chest, climbed up, and scrambled onto the roof. Below, antlers scraped the walls. A thick branch of an old tree stretched nearby. "Jump!" cried Peppa. They clasped hands and leapt. The hut collapsed behind them, but the red eyes glowed again in the mist. On the branch they froze. The forest seemed to breathe. Far away flickered a warm light like the glow of their home. "Home!" George said with relief. They climbed down and ran. The wind carried scents of apples and wet bark, but suddenly from both sides came, "Peppa!" "George!" The voices were familiar, yet echoed with a delay. The light drew near, then slipped away. At last, they saw their house. The door opened. On the porch stood Mummy Pig. "Where have you been?" We were worried. Beside her was Daddy with a checkered blanket. In the kitchen it smelled of pie. The kettle whistled. "Vegetables first," Daddy said, and George nodded. They embraced, but Peppa noticed strange details. Mummy wore a different apron. The clock ticked oddly. Dry needles stuck from the rug. "We got lost," Peppa whispered. "Now you're home," Mummy replied, and the phrase seemed to echo faintly. That night, Peppa woke. Outside the window wasn't the yard, but forest. The moon hung between branches. On the glass lay a thin shadow shaped like antlers. "He found us?" George muttered in his sleep. In the morning, all looked normal. Daddy read the paper, Mummy set the plates. But the door opened not to the path, but to a narrow trail among spruces. On the windowsill lay 2 pine cones. In the hall remained wet prints shaped like branches. "Did we come back?" George asked. "Of course," Mummy smiled. Her smile was warm, but her lips seemed to repeat the motion again, like a reflection in water. By day, they tried to walk into the yard, but after a few steps, the path curved and brought them back to the porch. "It happens," said Mummy. The word echoed faintly. In the evening, Peppa saw a note on the fridge. "Vegetables first." Beneath it stretched a scratch, splitting at the end like antlers. At night, the house creaked like wood, smelling of resin. From deep inside came slow, endless counting. In the morning, Mummy said, "Today we'll stay home. The forest is tired." Daddy nodded. The mat by the door grew damp. Beneath it, roots were pushing through. "Home is good," said Peppa. George smiled. In the glass, their reflections doubled, as if two more stood beside them. Then the shadow blurred, and antlers lay across the pane. Since then, at night, the house smelled of forest. Sometimes trees stood outside the window. Sometimes the yard returned. No one spoke of the cave or the red eyes. But each time Daddy said, "Vegetables first." A very close voice repeated the same words, with a delay. The deer monster no longer chased them through the thicket. He was already inside. It all started the day Peppa found a strange toy in her room. It was a Labubu, a small yellow monster with big black eyes and sharp teeth. Peppa couldn't remember where it came from. "What a cute toy! Where did you come from, little one?" she asked. Labubu remained silent, but his black eyes seemed to follow Peppa's every movement. That same day, a second window appeared in her room. The new window was old and dark, completely different from Peppa's usual window. Through the murky glass, instead of the familiar yard, there was a view of a gloomy, foggy forest. And strangest of all, in the forest grew trees that looked exactly like Labubu toys. "Mummy, look at this window and this strange forest," Peppa called out. But Mummy Pig replied, "Peppa dear, there's only one window in your room. And what's that toy you're holding?" Mummy couldn't see the second window, but even stranger, she couldn't see the Labubu toy either, even though Peppa was holding it right in front of her. On the first night, Peppa placed Labubu on her bedside table and went to sleep. But in the middle of the night, she woke up to a strange sound, the quiet grinding of teeth. In a quiet, creaky voice, Labubu whispered, "Peppa, Peppa, look out the window." You can talk," Peppa gasped. She turned to the second window. In the forest, she saw hundreds of small yellow figures, exactly like her toy. They stood between the trees, staring directly at her. Every night, the army of toy Labubus in the forest grew larger. They moved closer to the window, and their black eyes glowed in the darkness like little stars. "We've come for you, Peppa. You found us. Now we'll find you," Labubu said. "What do you want from me?" Peppa asked fearfully. "We want you to become one of us, forever," came the chilling reply. On the third night, Peppa woke up to find her hands had turned yellow, like Labubu's, and her eyes in the mirror seemed bigger and blacker than usual. "What's happening to me?" she cried. "You're becoming one of us. Soon you'll be able to live in our forest and we'll play forever," Labubu explained with a sinister smile. Peppa tried to throw away the Labubu toy, but it always returned to her room. She tried to close the second window, but it appeared on other walls. "Mummy! Daddy! Help me!" she screamed. But her parents couldn't see Labubu or hear his voice. To them, Peppa was just talking to herself. On the seventh night, the Labubu army came right up to the window. There were so many of them that the forest glowed with the yellow light of their bodies and the black gleam of their eyes. In chorus, they chanted, "It's time, Peppa. Time to join us." Peppa looked at herself in the mirror. Her skin had turned completely yellow. Her eyes were big and black, and the same horrifying smile as Labubu's appeared on her face. I'm ready," she said in a voice that now sounded like Labubu's. The second window opened by itself. Cold wind from the Labubu forest rushed into the room. Peppa, now looking more like a toy than a pig, stepped toward the window and disappeared into the night. In the morning, Mummy Pig came into Peppa's room to wake her up, but the bed was empty. On the windowsill lay only a small yellow Labubu toy with big black eyes. "Peppa, Peppa, where are you?" Mummy called out. She picked up the toy. For a moment, it seemed like Labubu winked at her and whispered quietly in a familiar voice, "I'm here, Mummy. I'll always be here." A week later, George found a strange toy in his room, a small yellow monster with big black eyes. And that same day, a second window appeared in his room. "Dinosaur! Dinosaur!" George exclaimed. "No, George, I'm Labubu, and soon you'll be Labubu too," the toy replied. In the forest beyond the window stood a figure that looked very much like Peppa, but with yellow skin and black eyes. She waved at George and smiled with Labubu's horrifying smile. Be careful with toys that appear out of nowhere. Sometimes they don't come to be played with, but to turn you into a toy. It all began with something small. Peppa woke up in her room and saw the sun shining through the window just like always. George was asleep beside her, lying on his side, hugging his dinosaur. Everything seemed ordinary. From downstairs came the familiar sounds. Mummy Pig making breakfast, Daddy Pig rustling his newspaper. Peppa went down, and on the table a bowl of porridge was waiting for her. But the porridge was cold. She tasted it. It had no flavor at all, no sweetness, no salt, just emptiness. Peppa frowned but said nothing. The day passed as usual. A walk in the garden, lunch, games with George, a bedtime story, and then sleep again. The next morning, everything repeated. George lay in the same position. Mummy cooked the same breakfast. Daddy held the newspaper in the same way. And again, the porridge was cold. Peppa thought it was déjà vu, but by the third day, it was clear. This was no coincidence. George said the same word, dinosaur. Her parents repeated the same phrases. The sun fell at the same angle, and everything followed the same script. On the fourth day, Peppa decided to test it. She didn't go down for breakfast, staying in her room instead. But nothing changed. Downstairs, the same voices continued. George said the same things. Her parents didn't notice her absence, as if it had already been written that way. "Mummy," Peppa asked cautiously, "what day is it today?" Mummy Pig looked at her and smiled, too wide. "Today is today." The words sounded hollow, like an echo. Time lost all meaning. Day after day, nothing changed. Only Peppa felt the growing unease. The walls began to seem alive. The windows glowed with a flat white light, as though they weren't showing the outside world at all, but painted scenery. Doors led to the same rooms, but at wrong angles, as if the house was folding and unfolding on itself. On the seventh day, Peppa woke up earlier than everyone else, or so it seemed. The room was dark, though the clock said it was morning. George lay beside her, his eyes wide open. He didn't blink, he didn't breathe. But when Peppa called his name, he suddenly sat up, smiled too quickly, too perfectly, and said, "Today will be a good day, Peppa." And then he froze again. Fear gripped her. She hid under the blanket, but deep down she knew this wasn't her home anymore. Soon Daddy Pig vanished. His place at the table was empty, though the newspaper still lay on the chair. Then Mummy disappeared. Then George. No one noticed their absence. It was as if they had never existed. Only Peppa remembered. On the final day, she gathered her courage and stepped outside. What met her wasn't the world. The grass was painted flat on the ground. The trees were cardboard cutouts. The sky was nothing but a dull grey light, without sun or clouds. It all looked like a stage set. And then she heard it. A monotonous, distorted melody, like something played on a broken record. From around the corner of the house came Tralalelo Tralala. His movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. His red eyes glowed in the half-light. His mouth opened and closed, and each time that same strange tune spilled out. Tralalelo, tralala. The sound echoed through the empty world, bouncing off the walls of her mind. Peppa tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. It was as if her feet were fused to the ground. Her thoughts grew heavy, blurred. The world around her shook, its lines smeared like wet paint. Then, among the cardboard trees, a figure appeared. dancing. Laughter pierced the grey sky, louder, sharper. It was literally Larilla. Her movements were graceful, spinning as if she was enjoying the nightmare. Her form broke apart into fragments, then reassembled, as if she didn't belong to this world at all. Peppa stood alone. The house behind her no longer looked like a home, but like another piece of scenery. The creatures closed in. Tralalelo Tralala stepped closer, his glowing red eyes burning brighter. Literally Larilla's laughter rose, her silhouette trembling, about to reach out for Peppa herself. And at that moment, Peppa understood. This wasn't a dream, not déjà vu, not repetition. It was a game, their game, and she was next. Peppa Pig, the forgotten friend, and Labubu. One day, Peppa was rummaging through an old wardrobe when her attention was drawn to a large photo album covered in a thick layer of dust. The cover was worn, the page edges charred with age, and the album itself smelled of dampness, as if it had been hidden in a basement for years. Carefully, Peppa blew off the dust and opened it. On the first pages were ordinary pictures, family walks, holidays, their house and garden. But soon she came across photographs where a sheep in a blue dress stood beside her. The smile of this girl looked strangely familiar, yet Peppa could not recall her. Beneath the photos was written, Peppa and Lucy. Peppa's heart tightened with a strange feeling. She couldn't remember Lucy at all, but looking at the photographs filled her with a sense of longing, as if she had lost something very important. At dinner that evening, Peppa gathered her courage. "Mum, Dad, who is Lucy?" Her parents exchanged glances. "Lucy," repeated Mummy Pig. "We don't know any Lucy, dear. You've never had a friend with that name." "But she's in the photographs," insisted Peppa. Daddy Pig frowned and muttered, "You must be mistaken." Their answers only deepened her unease. Peppa felt they were deliberately avoiding the truth. That same night, she opened the album again and noticed that there were more photos than before. New ones had appeared between the pages, ones she was certain hadn't been there earlier. In them, Lucy stood close to Peppa, hugging her, holding her hoof. On one picture, at the bottom, in thin handwriting, it read, "Do you remember me?" From that moment, the strangeness only grew. In her toy box, Peppa found a doll that looked remarkably like Lucy. Its woolen face was slightly faded, the blue dress cracked and torn, as though it had lain forgotten for decades. Peppa was certain this doll had never been there before. Soon, drawings began to appear around the house, in charcoal, in pencil, sometimes right on the walls. Everywhere was Lucy, at first smiling, then darker and darker with each sketch. Peppa increasingly felt the weight of an unseen gaze. Labubu, her favorite toy that always sat by her pillow, now looked different. His button eyes seemed alive, watching her every move. His smile, once sweet, now resembled a cruel smirk. Sometimes she noticed that Labubu was sitting in places she hadn't left him. One night, Peppa woke to a strange whisper. The room was quiet, George still asleep, but near the wardrobe stood an old wooden door. It looked as if it had always been part of the room, yet Peppa knew for certain it had never been there before. The whisper came from behind it. "Peppa, come to me. I will tell you everything." The voice was soft, almost gentle, yet it sent chills down her spine. Peppa sat up in bed. Labubu sat by her pillow and suddenly began to sway slowly from side to side. His eyes glimmered with a faint red light. The whisper grew stronger, more insistent, calling her name. Shaking, Peppa rose and stepped toward the door. The wooden handle chilled her hoof, as if someone on the other side was touching it too. "Remember me?" The voice echoed again. She slowly opened the door. Behind it was no room, no corridor, only emptiness, endless and dark. A cold wind struck her face. and before she could scream, the darkness pulled her inside. The door slammed shut with a long, heavy creak. The next morning, her parents entered the room to wake the children. George slept soundly, but Peppa's bed was empty. On the wall hung a new photograph. In it stood Lucy the sheep, and beside her, Peppa. But the expression on the girl's face was frightened, distant. At their feet sat Labubu. His eyes glowed red, and on his face was the same crooked smile that Lucy wore. Her parents found neither Peppa nor the album. Only a small doll, a copy of Lucy, lay on the floor near her bed, and no one, except Labubu, knew where Peppa had gone. It had been drizzling all day. At first it was quiet, barely noticeable, but by evening the rain grew heavy and relentless. Drops drummed on the roof. The windows trembled with a fine shiver. The sky was fully overcast, and the forest beyond the house seemed like an endless wall of darkness. The wind wandered through the branches, and from time to time came a creak, as if something enormous was moving through the thicket. Peppa and George sat in the living room. They tried to play with building blocks, but the tower collapsed again and again, sometimes from their clumsiness, sometimes from the pounding rain that shook the whole house. Their parents were gone. Mummy and Daddy Pig had gone to town and left dinner for the children. The house seemed cozy, but the longer the rain lasted, the more it felt as though something alien was hiding outside the windows. When the first howl came, George flinched and dropped a block. It was a long, drawn-out sound, unlike anything they had ever heard. Not wind, not an animal, something else entirely. It slid under the skin and echoed in the bones. Peppa stood up and walked to the window. Beyond the glass, she saw two enormous red lights. They glowed motionless, but so brightly that their cold radiance pierced through the rain. Peppa realized they were eyes staring straight at their house. "What is that?" George whispered, pressing against his sister. At that very moment, there was a knock at the door, slow and heavy, as if struck by a hoof. The knock came again, louder, and was joined by a dreadful scratching, sharp claws raking the wood. "Don't open it!" George pleaded, but curiosity won. Peppa's trembling hands opened the door just a crack. On the threshold stood the deer monster. His antlers stretched high, sharp as blades. His eyes burned with sinister light, and dark liquid dripped from his jaws. The creature stepped inside. Its hooves left black marks on the floor, smoke rising from each print. With every movement, the house grew colder, the lamps overhead dimmer. "You cannot leave," it rasped, voice like rusted metal scraping stone. "Now you belong to the forest." The children rushed to the windows, but they slammed shut on their own. The door behind the monster crashed closed. The house seemed alive, no longer willing to let them out. The floor quaked, the walls groaned, the ceiling cracked. The monster's antlers began to grow, splitting the beams above. Shadows in the corners stretched into shapes like long, reaching arms. Peppa grabbed George and pulled him toward the stairs. For a moment, it seemed safer upstairs, but the monster's steps thundered after them, each one shaking the walls. On the second floor, the windows no longer showed their yard. Through the glass stood tree trunks, as though the house had been carried deep into the forest. The wind howled in the corridors, and on the walls seeped patterns of moss and pine needles. Peppa and George hid in their room, but the door swung open on its own. The monster entered, its eyes lighting the walls and turning shadows into writhing beasts. "Now, the house is part of the forest," it hissed. Its antlers pierced through the ceiling, and the floor was covered with a thin layer of water, as if the rain had spilled indoors. The children screamed, but their voices drowned in the roar of the storm. Everything grew darker, colder. The room dissolved, walls fading away, replaced by the rising trunks of trees. The night dragged on endlessly. Peppa and George no longer knew where their home was. In the village, or already swallowed by the woods, they clung to each other as the monster's steps and breathing echoed around them. When morning came and their parents returned, the door opened without resistance. The house was quiet. Toys lay scattered on the floor, the lights were on, but the children were gone. Only 2 small pairs of shoes stood neatly by the threshold. But the house was strange. The hallway smelled of resin, damp stains spread across the walls, and pine cones lay in the corner. Mummy and Daddy Pig exchanged a glance but said nothing. Since then, children's voices are sometimes heard in the forest at night. They call for help, call for home, but the path always leads deeper into the thicket, and among the trees still roams the deer monster. Sometimes in the windows of the empty house his eyes can be seen, red, unblinking, just like that night when Peppa and George opened the door. Night fell over Peppa Pig's house. It all began ordinarily, dinner, casual conversation, but something hung in the air. Peppa felt her parents were acting differently. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig sat at the table too quietly. Their eyes reflected the light of the lamp, but inside, there was nothing, like 2 glass orbs, no emotions, no warmth. Peppa pushed her plate away, a lump stuck in her throat. George, usually restless, sat silently, clutching his dinosaur tightly. The silence at the table was so heavy that the ticking of the hallway clock sounded like hammer strikes. Later, deep in the night, Peppa woke to a strange sound. Something rustled dully in the corridor. She woke George, and together, they cautiously left their room. There was no moonlight, only a faint flicker of a lamp from the living room. They came closer and peeked through the crack in the door, and froze. Mummy and Daddy Pig stood in the middle of the room, motionless, like statues. Their bodies swayed slightly, as if held by invisible strings. Their eyes were completely black, without a glimmer, and their smiles stretched from ear to ear. "Go back to bed," came Daddy Pig's voice. But it sounded hollow, like an echo in a cave. It was his voice, and at the same time, not his. The children stumbled back and ran to their room. Peppa hid under the blanket and couldn't sleep for a long time. It seemed like the shadows on the walls were moving on their own. The morning only made things worse. At breakfast, Daddy Pig smiled too wide, showing sharp teeth that had never been there before. Mummy moved around the kitchen with unnerving grace, her steps too smooth, too perfect, like a rehearsal of a dance. Peppa glanced at George, but he only shook his head. He was scared. At that moment, something shifted outside the window. First, a shadow, enormous, covering half the yard. Then a heavy step that made the dishes on the table rattle. And then Peppa saw him, Bombardiro Crocodilo, but not the one she once knew. His eyes glowed scarlet, his jaws slightly open, and every tooth shone like a blade. His massive body moved slowly, but each step echoed deep through the ground. He drew closer to the house, and with every lash of his tail, the walls trembled. Peppa shrank back from the window in horror. Mummy and Daddy didn't react. They continued their movements, as if programmed. Suddenly, a voice rang out. Not from her parents, not from outside. It sounded directly inside Peppa's head, low and crushing. "You're watching this. Press the hype button below the video before it's too late." Peppa gasped in terror. It felt like those words weren't meant only for her, as if Bombardiro Crocodilo himself was speaking to someone else, watching alongside her. She grabbed George's hand, and they ran into the corridor. But it was darker than usual. Doors that had never existed appeared along the walls. From each came whispers and rasping breaths. Bulbs flickered and went out one by one. From the living room came a scraping sound. The children froze. Suddenly, Mummy Pig stepped into the corridor. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Her smile was far too wide, her eyes completely empty. Behind her appeared Daddy. They walked in sync, without hesitation. "Children must obey," they said together in one voice. Peppa and George rushed to the front door, but Bombardiero's silhouette was already outside the glass. His shadow blocked out all the light. His breathing rumbled like a volcano. He tilted his head, and his scarlet eyes blazed even brighter. "We are waiting!" his voice thundered. The door swung open on its own, and a cold wind swept inside. But it wasn't the wind. It was the breath of the crocodilo. It dragged darkness behind it, filling the entire corridor. Peppa screamed, but the sound drowned in the roar. George cowered behind her, his hands shaking. Mummy and Daddy stepped closer, their bodies distorted, merging with the shadows. They no longer seemed to belong to the world of the living. Bombardiero raised his claw and struck the ground. The house shuddered. Windows cracked. The chandelier swayed. He took another step forward, and at that moment, everything around began to warp. Rooms vanished, walls stretched and collapsed, turning into an endless corridor. Peppa clutched her brother and shut her eyes. But even through her eyelids, she saw the red glow of his eyes. The last thing she heard was the sound of a broken melody, like the beat of a heart, and a deep, triumphant growl. "Now you are mine." And the night swallowed everything.